A raven's call carries across an empty land. Greetings, friends. John speaks once more, and I am glad you've joined me by the fire. Tonight we follow the old roads of the north, where broken towers still watch silent hills, and the wind remembers names long forgotten. Peace has returned to Middle-earth, yet some echoes refuse to fade with the passing of the years. Come quietly now, and let us walk where every weathered stone may still keep an ancient secret. The spring rains had finally withdrawn from the northern lands, leaving the old roads of Arna damp beneath fresh grass and scattered white blossoms. Morning mist drifted across the low hills, rising slowly as the sun climbed behind distant ridges where forgotten watchtowers still stood against the sky. Many years had passed since the fall of the Dark Lord, and peace had settled over Middle-earth with a patience earned through sorrow rather than triumph. King Elessar ruled from Minas Tirith, and his messengers rode farther each season as the reunited kingdom stretched its hands toward lands abandoned for generations. Yet the north remained quiet in a different way, carrying memories that even sunlight could not fully chase away. Travelers spoke softly when the ruins of old Arna appeared beside the road, for every broken wall seemed to remember another age. The rangers who guarded those empty lands knew every stream and ridge, every hidden path beneath the pines, and every crumbling stone left from kingdoms long fallen. Their lives were seldom sung by minstrels, though they kept danger from villages that rarely knew their names. They walked lightly through forests, where wolves still hunted, and watched over lonely farms that clung to the edge of wilderness. Among them served Halber's grandson, a young ranger named Baranor, whose years had been spent learning patience before skill. His father often reminded him that the north rewarded careful eyes more than swift blades, and Baranor had listened well, though his heart still longed for the day when he might prove worthy of the grey cloak he wore. Even so, he hoped that such a day would never require the suffering of innocent folk. At dawn, Baranor stood upon a weathered hill overlooking the greenway, watching merchants guide 2 wagons toward Bree beneath fluttering banners of the reunited kingdom. He noticed how easily children laughed beside the road now, chasing one another through patches of wildflowers where soldiers had once marched in fear. That sight pleased him more than he admitted aloud, for he had grown up on tales of darker years when every traveler feared sunset. A raven crossed overhead with slow, deliberate wing beats before vanishing toward the north. His older companion, the ranger Hendash, narrowed his eyes as he followed the bird's flight. "The birds have been restless for 3 mornings," the older man murmured, adjusting the leather strap across his shoulder. Baranor heard the words but found no answer, for the same uneasy feeling had already settled quietly within him. Before noon, another ranger arrived from the north, his horse flecked with foam and his face darkened by road dust. He dismounted without wasting breath and accepted a skin of water before speaking, as though every heartbeat mattered. 3 shepherds had vanished near the Weather Hills, he reported, and 2 abandoned farms had been found with doors hanging open, while hearth fires still smouldered in cold ashes. There were no bodies, no signs of battle, and scarcely a track upon the ground beyond confused footprints ending among broken stones. Hendrik exchanged a long glance with Baranor before asking whether wolves had been seen. The messenger shook his head slowly. "If wolves had done this," he replied, "there would be blood enough for crows, and there was none." The rangers rode north before the afternoon shadows had begun to lengthen, following narrow trails that wound between old hedgerows swallowed by briars. Wind stirred through ancient oaks, carrying the scent of damp bark and young leaves, while distant streams murmured unseen beyond the hills. Baranor found himself studying every bend in the path, remembering lessons drilled into him since childhood. Tracks told stories only to those willing to kneel and listen, his father had often said, and silence itself could reveal more than frightened witnesses. Several times he left the saddle to examine patches of soft earth, yet nothing seemed disturbed beyond the passing of deer and foxes. The absence of signs troubled him more than clear evidence would have done, for skilled hands had hidden whatever truth lay ahead. As evening drew near, they reached the first deserted farm. Chickens wandered freely through the yard, pecking at scattered grain that no one had gathered. A wooden bucket still rested beside the well with clear water inside, untouched except by drifting leaves. The cottage door creaked gently upon one hinge as the wind moved it back and forth with slow insistence. Inside, bowls remained upon the table beside half-finished bread, hardened by passing days, and a child's carved toy horse lay beneath a bench where it had fallen. Baranor crouched beside the little carving and brushed away dust with careful fingers. Nothing had been stolen, nothing broken, yet every living soul had vanished as though the earth itself had quietly swallowed them. Hendrik searched the yard while Baranor circled beyond the fields, following the edge where tilled soil met rough pasture. At first he found nothing except sheep tracks fading into older prints, but then a shallow scrape upon a flat stone caught his eye. Kneeling closer, he discovered tiny fragments of black cloth caught beneath rough edges where something heavy had passed. The fabric was unlike the homespun garments worn by farmers, finer in weave, yet stained by mud and smoke. Hendrik examined it in silence before slipping the scraps into a leather pouch. "Not orc work," he said at last, speaking almost to himself, "and not the clothing of any honest traveler." Night settled over the hills with uncommon stillness, wrapping the abandoned farm in darkness, broken only by the ranger's small fire hidden behind loose stones. They spoke little while supper warmed over the flames, each man listening beyond the crackling wood for sounds carried upon the wind. Owls hunted somewhere beyond the fields, and once a fox barked in the distance before silence returned. Baranor could not free his thoughts from the untouched bread inside the cottage or the toy horse left waiting for hands that had never returned. He wondered whether fear had filled the house suddenly, or whether those who lived there had followed someone willingly into the night. Neither answer brought comfort. Before dawn, Baranor awoke without knowing why. The fire had burned to glowing embers, and pale stars still lingered above the western horizon. A faint sound drifted across the fields, so distant that he first mistook it for wind moving through grass, yet it came again with slow, uneven rhythm. It resembled the striking of iron against stone, muffled as though heard beneath the earth itself. Hendrik was awake as well, already watching the darkness beyond the ruined fence. Neither ranger spoke until the sound faded entirely. Then the older man quietly rose, gathered his gear, and said, "We follow that after sunrise." Morning light revealed another unsettling discovery. Beyond the pasture stood a line of ancient standing stones left from forgotten peoples who had dwelt in those lands before the kingdoms of men had risen. Between two of the weathered pillars, someone had recently kindled a small fire, though only cold ashes remained. Baranor sifted through them with a stick until he uncovered a fragment of carved bone marked by crude symbols, unlike any script he recognized. Hendrik studied the markings with a troubled expression before wrapping the piece carefully in cloth. "This was made recently," he said, his voice low and measured. "Yet the signs imitate things far older than the hands that carved them." By midday they reached a narrow valley where the old road disappeared beneath fallen rock and tangled brush. Hidden among the trees lay another abandoned dwelling, smaller than the first and built against the hillside. This time there were footprints, though only a handful, leading toward the northern slopes before ending abruptly on bare stone. Baranor searched patiently for nearly an hour until he found the answer. Several loose branches had been dragged behind the departing travelers to sweep away the remaining trail, a trick known among hunters and outlaws alike. Whoever had passed through the valley wished to be followed only as far as they allowed. The sun lowered behind gathering clouds, while the rangers climbed toward broken ridges overlooking the valley. From that height, Baranor could see miles of lonely country stretching northward toward lands where the shadow of Angmar had once spread terror across Arnor. The ruins seemed peaceful from afar, softened by moss and green growth. Yet he knew how many kingdoms had bled upon those hills. His grandfather had told him that evil often returned wearing a different face, borrowing old fears because they were easier to awaken than new ones. Looking across the empty land, Baranor felt that warning settle heavily in his mind. Whatever force had taken the missing villagers, it was no wandering band of thieves, driven only by hunger. As the first drops of rain began to fall once more, a lone rider appeared upon the southern road, urging his horse toward them with desperate speed. The animal stumbled from exhaustion before reaching the hilltop, and the man nearly fell as he dismounted with trembling legs. He wore the badge of the king upon his cloak, though dust and torn cloth had nearly hidden it from sight. Catching his breath with visible effort, he looked from Hendash to Baranor, before speaking words that chilled both rangers despite the mild spring air. "The villages farther north are empty as well," he said, swallowing hard. "And the folk of Bree have begun to whisper that the shadow of Angmar has awakened again." Rain followed them through the afternoon, falling in a steady curtain that softened the distant hills until they seemed no more than fading memories beneath the grey sky. The messenger rode between Hendash and Baranor, speaking only when his breath had returned and the horses found easier ground along the old greenway. His name was Coran, one of the king's mounted couriers who carried news between Bree and the scattered settlements farther north. He admitted that he had never seen such fear take hold so quickly among sensible folk. Rumors had outrun the truth, and every empty cottage had become another tale of ghosts, cursed kings, or servants of the Witch King returning from forgotten graves. Baranor listened without interruption, knowing that panic could spread faster than any army if left unchecked. "They say lights have been seen upon the hills after sunset," Coran said, as they crossed a shallow ford where cold water rushed over smooth stones. One shepherd swore he heard voices speaking in the black speech, though another claimed they sounded like ordinary men whispering through masks. Hendach guided his horse carefully over the slippery crossing before answering. "Men hear what fear teaches them to hear. The black speech is not lightly forgotten by those who truly knew it, and I doubt that such words now linger in these lands." Coran nodded, though doubt still clouded his face. Baranor watched the current swirl around the horse's legs and wondered whether someone was counting on frightened minds to remember old horrors before considering simpler explanations. By evening, they reached a small ranger outpost, hidden among ancient beeches, where little more than a stone shelter and a stable stood beneath the trees. Smoke rose from a narrow chimney, carrying the familiar scent of oak wood into the damp air. Two rangers emerged as the riders approached, each wearing weathered cloaks darkened by years of rain and travel. Their greetings were brief, for one look at Coran's tired face told them that ill news had arrived before words were spoken. Inside the shelter, maps were unrolled, across a broad wooden table scarred by countless knives and ink stains left by generations of watchmen. A lantern cast warm light across faded parchments that showed the old boundaries of Arna, long before its fall. Hendrik placed a small stone upon each abandoned village while the others watched in silence. The pattern became clear after only a few moments, and Baranor leaned closer as realization slowly formed in his mind. None of the settlements lay at random. They traced a rough line stretching toward the northeast, where the broken lands beneath the weather hills gave way to wilder country leading toward the old borders of Angmar. "Someone is moving people," Baranor said quietly. "Or driving them." Hendrik rested both hands upon the table and gave a slow nod. "And always in the same direction." One of the older rangers, a broad-shouldered man named Kadan, disappeared into a storage room before returning with a worn leather bundle. He untied the straps carefully and spread several yellowed pages across the table. They were copies of reports written decades earlier by rangers who had hunted the last scattered servants of Angmar after the Witch King's fall. The ink had faded, but careful hands had preserved every word. Baranor noticed repeated mentions of forgotten paths beneath ruined fortresses, hidden wells, and tunnels carved into the hills long before the coming of Númenórean kings. "Many places were never fully searched," Kadan explained, tapping one brittle page. "Too many ruins, too much wilderness. Some were simply abandoned when no enemy remained." The room fell quiet as rain drummed against the roof. Baranor studied one crude map where an old watchtower overlooked a valley marked only with the word Fornost Road, though little remained of that road now beyond broken stones, hidden beneath grass. A faded note beside the drawing caught his attention. It spoke of ancient escape passages built by the Dunedain during the wars against Angmar, passages later used by spies and raiders alike. Hendrik noticed where Baranor's eyes had settled. "If someone found those ways again," he said, "they could move unseen across half the north." The thought settled heavily over everyone present. Before dawn, the rangers divided their strength. Kadan would ride south to reassure the frightened settlements nearer Bree, while Hendrik, Baranor, and Coran pressed north toward the abandoned watchtower marked upon the old map. The forest gradually gave way to rough hills, where twisted pines clung stubbornly to rocky slopes. Clouds drifted low enough to brush the highest ridges, hiding distant ground and muffling every sound beyond a few hundred paces. More than once Baranor believed he glimpsed movement among scattered boulders, but each time he found only grazing deer or wind bending the dark branches. Even so, the feeling of unseen eyes remained with him throughout the climb. Near midday they discovered fresh tracks, crossing a patch of soft earth beneath an overhanging cliff. At least 12 men had passed that way within the last day, some wearing heavy boots, while others walked in lighter footwear fit for long journeys. Baranor crouched beside the prince, measuring their depth with careful fingers. One trail showed the mark of a limping traveler whose left foot dragged slightly across the ground. Another belonged to someone carrying great weight upon his shoulders. Hendrik silently counted the tracks before looking toward the north. "Disciplined," he murmured. They walked in pairs and no one strayed. These were not frightened villagers wandering without purpose. The trail led them into a narrow ravine where moss covered the stones and little sunlight reached the ground. The air felt colder there, carrying the scent of damp earth and old roots instead of growing grass. Ravens perched high above on broken ledges, watching without a sound as the rangers advanced beneath them. Coran reached instinctively toward the sword at his side, but did not draw it. Baranor found himself matching his breathing to each careful step, avoiding loose stones that might betray their presence. Somewhere ahead, faint but unmistakable, came the distant ring of iron striking iron. Hendrik raised a hand, and all three halted beneath a leaning ash tree. The metallic sound came again, followed this time by the scrape of something heavy being dragged across stone. It was not the rhythm of a smith working a forge. The pauses were too long, the blows too measured, as though men labored to force open something sealed long ago. Baranor crept forward until the ravine widened enough to reveal a slope strewn with ancient rubble. Half hidden beneath ivy and fallen earth stood the remains of a weathered gate built from enormous blocks of grey stone. Several men worked before the ruined entrance. Their clothing was plain, mostly dark wool and leather, with scarves wrapped across their faces against the rain. They carried no banners, no badges, and no colours that might reveal allegiance. Two stood watch with bows, while others levered at cracked stones using heavy iron bars. Baranor counted 15 before another emerged from behind the ruins, carrying a lantern despite the daylight. None resembled orcs or creatures of darker races. They were men, ordinary in appearance, yet every movement showed planning and discipline. Corin leaned close enough to whisper, without carrying his voice beyond the sheltering rocks. "What are they opening?" he breathed. Hendrik did not answer at once. His eyes remained fixed upon the ancient gate where faded carvings still survived beneath moss. At last he spoke so softly that Baranor barely heard him. "An old refuge of Arnor, if the map speaks true. It was sealed after the wars because every passage beneath these hills became a road for the enemy as easily as for our own people." Baranor felt a chill unrelated to the damp air. Someone had not stumbled upon these ruins by chance. They had come seeking them. The rangers withdrew before the hidden guards could notice movement among the rocks. They climbed higher into the hills until the ruined gate disappeared beneath the folds of the valley. Only then did Hendrik allow himself to stop. He knelt upon the wet ground and drew a rough sketch of the valley with the point of his knife, marking the sentries, the gate, and the surrounding ridges from memory. Baranor understood at once what troubled him most. 15 men could not have emptied so many villages, nor could they defend such a place if discovered. Somewhere beyond those hills waited many more, and whoever commanded them had prepared this work long before the first farm had fallen silent. Hendrik covered the sketch with his palm before rain could wash away the lines, studying every mark one last time as though committing the valley to memory. The 3 men remained silent while the wind swept across the ridge, carrying the faint scent of wet stone from below. Baranor lay upon his stomach and looked back through a narrow gap between 2 rocks. The workers still labored at the ancient gate with patient determination, stopping only when one of the guards signaled toward the surrounding hills. Whoever commanded them tolerated neither haste nor carelessness. That alone convinced Baranor they faced no common band of robbers. Such discipline belonged to men following a purpose greater than plunder. "We cannot strike them," Hendrik said at last, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "Even if we won, we would learn nothing except how many of us could die before sunset." Corin frowned, though he knew the older ranger spoke wisely. "Then what do we do while they uncover whatever lies beneath that hill?" he asked. Hendrik rested one hand upon the damp earth. "We follow their road instead of blocking it. Every army leaves a trail somewhere, even one that wishes to remain unseen." Baranor nodded slowly, already understanding the plan before another word was spoken. The rangers circled westward through rough country, where ancient forests climbed the hills in tangled silence. Moss-coated fallen trunks and thick ferns hid the ground beneath broad green fronds that brushed against their boots with every step. More than once, Baranor paused to examine broken twigs or flattened patches of grass that others might have overlooked. He found signs of men passing in small groups rather than one large company. A snapped hazel branch still bled fresh sap, while boot prints appeared only where rain had failed to erase them beneath overhanging rock. The trail spread like the roots of an old tree, dividing and joining again across the wilderness. By late afternoon, they reached the remains of an abandoned watchtower standing upon a lonely rise. Only half its circular wall remained, yet the upper stones still offered a clear view across the valleys stretching toward the north. Baranor climbed carefully through the broken interior, while Hendersh searched below for signs of recent visitors. At the top, he crouched behind weathered battlements, letting his eyes adjust to the changing light. Thin columns of smoke rose from 3 distant places far beyond the ruined gate. They were too straight to be woodland fires and too carefully hidden to belong to wandering shepherds. Someone had established camps throughout the hills. Coran joined him after a few moments and narrowed his eyes toward the northern horizon. "Those fires are spaced evenly," he observed, "as though each can see the next." Baranor followed the invisible line, connecting one plume to another before understanding. The camps formed a chain, stretching deeper into the old lands once ruled from Khan Dom. Messages could pass from one to another within minutes, using smoke by day or fire after dark. Hendersh climbed onto the tower beside them and studied the same view without speaking. His expression hardened as the pieces fell together. "They are building a road of signals," he said quietly. "Not for trade, for command." The Rangers remained hidden until twilight cloaked the hills. As darkness settled, one fire after another vanished beneath carefully placed covers until the valleys seemed empty once more. Then, for only a heartbeat, a pale blue light flashed from the northernmost ridge before disappearing. Moments later, another answered farther south, followed by a third near the ruined gate. The signals were brief enough that any traveler might mistake them for distant lightning. Baranor counted 5 flashes before silence returned. No storm clouds gathered overhead. These lights belonged to deliberate hands. "We move tonight," Hendersh decided. "If they travel under darkness, we must learn where they go." None argued. They descended from the tower, leading their horses through the forest rather than riding, for hooves upon stone carried farther than whispered voices. The moon remained hidden behind drifting clouds, leaving the woodland wrapped in deep shadow. Baranor welcomed the darkness despite its dangers. Rangers had long learned that the night concealed the hunter as readily as the hunted, provided pride did not tempt careless movement. Several hours passed before they heard footsteps ahead. Hendersh motioned the others behind a fallen oak, whose roots had torn a great wound in the hillside many winters before. Through the branches, they watched 6 men emerge along the narrow path, each carrying bundles strapped tightly across his back. No one spoke above a murmur. The men walked with the quiet confidence of those who knew the road well, pausing only once while the leader examined a carved mark upon an old beech tree before continuing eastward. Baranor noticed that every bundle appeared of similar weight and shape, wrapped in thick cloth against the weather. The rangers followed at a careful distance, never allowing the faint sound of the stranger's footsteps to fade entirely. The path wound between steep slopes before descending into a hollow where dense yews blocked nearly all moonlight. There the 6 men halted beside what appeared to be nothing more than a moss-covered boulder. One bent low, cleared away loose leaves, and pulled upon an iron ring hidden beneath the earth. With surprising ease, a flat slab of stone lifted upward, revealing a narrow stair leading into darkness below. One by one, the strangers disappeared beneath the hill, lowering the entrance behind them until no trace remained. Baranor waited until several long minutes had passed before creeping toward the concealed doorway. He brushed away damp leaves exactly where he had seen the man kneel, and soon uncovered the iron ring with his fingertips. The stone was cleverly balanced despite its size. Hendrik stopped him before he could lift it. "Not yet," he whispered. "If others are behind us, they will find us trapped below." Baranor withdrew his hand, though every instinct urged him to see what lay hidden beneath. Patience, he reminded himself. A ranger who hurried into darkness often never returned. Instead, they searched the hollow itself. Corran discovered old cart ruts nearly erased by grass, leading toward a narrow ravine that would have concealed wagons from anyone watching the surrounding hills. Hendrik followed the tracks until they ended beside a shallow stream where the current washed away every further sign. Nearby, Baranor found fresh horse droppings, still warm despite the cool night. More animals had passed this way than the 6 men they had followed. Supplies were moving underground in quantities too great for a handful of outlaws. As they prepared to withdraw, Baranor noticed something glimmering beneath tangled ivy growing along the ravine wall. He carefully pulled aside the vines and uncovered a weathered stone carved with the white tree of Gondor, or rather, with its far older emblem from the days of Arna. The carving had been broken deliberately long ago, its upper half shattered by heavy blows. Yet someone had recently scraped away the moss covering the lower portion, exposing the ancient symbol once more. Hendrik ran thoughtful fingers across the scarred surface. "They searched for this marker," he murmured. "They knew exactly where to look." The discovery unsettled him more than the hidden entrance itself. Knowledge of such forgotten signs belonged to the rangers and to a few scholars in the libraries of the king. Ordinary hillmen would never have recognized them beneath centuries of moss and tangled roots. Corran voiced the question already forming in Baranor's thoughts. Who taught them? Hendrik remained silent for several moments before answering. Someone who has studied the old kingdom with great care. Perhaps an exile. Perhaps a learned man who has chosen a darker road. Whoever he is, he understands Arna almost as well as we do. The eastern sky had begun to pale when the 3 companions finally returned to their hidden horses. They had learned enough to know the danger was real, yet too little to understand its full purpose. Behind them, the hills remained quiet beneath the fading stars, revealing nothing of the tunnels concealed within their ancient bones. Baranor mounted without another word, but one thought refused to leave him. The enemy was not awakening the shadow of Angmar. They were carefully dressing themselves in its memory, and someone with deep knowledge of the North was showing them exactly how to do it. The morning broke clear at last, and the rain-washed hills shone beneath pale sunlight that caught upon wet stone and brightened every blade of grass. It might have been mistaken for a peaceful day by any traveler passing along the old roads, yet Baranor found the silence more unsettling than the storms of previous days. The hidden tunnels, the disciplined bands of men, and the carefully restored waymarks had transformed the landscape in his thoughts. Everywhere he looked, he imagined unseen eyes watching from broken walls or dark tree lines. Hendrik appeared no less troubled, though years of experience hid his concern behind the calm expression of a ranger long accustomed to danger. Corran rode quietly between them, no longer speaking of ghosts or ancient curses, for the truth they had uncovered was proving both simpler and more dangerous. They avoided the greenway altogether, and instead followed forgotten paths known only to rangers and wandering hunters. The trail wound through thick stands of oak before climbing onto open heath where heather spread in purple patches across the hills. Shortly before noon, Hendrik raised a hand and guided the others behind a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. Smoke rose from a lonely farmstead surrounded by low stone walls and grazing sheep. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary, yet Baranor noticed 2 armed men standing beside the barn, while another watched the road from a haystack. Their weapons were kept out of sight as much as possible, but they were no farmers. Hendrik studied the place through narrowed eyes. "The people living there are not among those reported missing," he said softly. "If strangers have taken the farm, we must know why." Baranor volunteered before the words had fully formed in his mind. "Let me go alone. 1 traveler draws less notice than 3 armed riders." Hendrik considered him for a long moment before nodding once. "You carry no sword where they can see it. Ask for water, nothing more. If danger comes, do not play the hero. Learn what you can and return." Baranor left his cloak rolled behind the saddle and approached the farm dressed like any weary traveler. Dust clung to his boots by the time he reached the gate, and he allowed his shoulders to sag with practiced fatigue. One of the armed men stepped forward, pretending to mend a fence while carefully blocking the path. He was broad-shouldered, perhaps 40 years of age, with weathered hands and a scar running beneath one eye. "You've wandered far," the man observed without warmth. Baranor smiled politely and inclined his head. "Far enough to value a drink of clean water, if your kindness allows it." The man's gaze lingered upon Baranor's face before he finally gestured toward the well. "Drink, then be on your road before nightfall." His voice carried neither menace nor welcome. As Baranor lowered the bucket into the cool water, he allowed his eyes to wander naturally across the yard. The farmhouse itself showed no signs of struggle. Fresh bread cooled upon a windowsill, tools rested where honest work might leave them, and sheep grazed peacefully beyond the walls. Yet there were too many horses for a family farm, all well-fed and recently shod. More telling still, every stable door stood closed despite the mild weather. A woman emerged from the house, carrying a basket of vegetables, accompanied by 2 children, no older than 8 or 9. The children glanced nervously toward the strangers before disappearing back inside without a word. Their mother offered Baranor the briefest of smiles, but fear lingered plainly in her eyes. She was not a prisoner in chains, yet neither did she move with the ease of one secure in her own home. Baranor thanked the man for the water and turned to leave. As he reached the gate, the younger child suddenly darted outside, clutching a wooden toy carved in the shape of a fox. The little boy stumbled, dropping the toy near Baranor's feet before his mother hurried to retrieve him. As she bent to lift the carving, her hand paused for the briefest instant. With one finger hidden beneath the toy, she traced a tiny mark in the damp earth beside Baranor's boot. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat before she wiped it away while lifting her son into her arms. The mark had been simple enough that only someone trained among the rangers would have noticed its meaning. North. Beneath. Hurry! Baranor walked calmly down the road until the farm disappeared behind a line of trees. Only then did he quicken his pace toward the waiting rangers hidden upon the ridge. Hendrik listened without interrupting as every detail was recounted, from the guarded stable to the frightened children and the silent message scratched into the soil. Corin frowned thoughtfully. "She knew ranger signs," he said. Hendrik shook his head. Not ranger signs, older than that. They were once taught to loyal folk living near our hidden roads during the last wars against Angmar. Very few would remember them now. He looked back toward the distant farm with growing concern. Someone there trusts the king's rangers enough to risk her life. The three companions waited until evening, before returning under cover of gathering shadows. They left their horses hidden in a small copse and crept toward the farm on foot, moving with the slow patience that years of woodland travel had taught them. No lights burned openly in the windows, though muted voices drifted from within the barn. Baranor circled wide until he reached the rear of the stable, where stacked firewood offered concealment. Through a narrow crack between the boards, he saw nearly 20 armed men gathered around rough tables. Maps lay spread before them, weighted by mugs and knives, while one man traced routes across the parchment with the point of a dagger. "We take the next village in 2 nights," the leader said, his voice steady and controlled. "No blood unless resistance leaves no choice. Bring every able hand. Burn nothing. We need houses standing." A younger man frowned. "The people will not follow forever." The leader's answer came without hesitation. They need not follow willingly. Once they see what lies beneath the old fortress, they will understand their purpose. Murmurs spread through the room, though not all sounded convinced. Baranor noticed several uneasy glances exchanged among the men. Another figure entered from a side door, cloaked despite the warmth inside the barn. Unlike the others, he carried no weapon that Baranor could see. He placed a leather case upon the table and withdrew several brittle sheets of parchment covered in faded writing. Even from a distance, Baranor recognized the careful hand of a skilled copyist reproducing ancient texts. The cloaked man tapped one page before speaking. "You waste time searching the wrong valleys. The second entrance lies farther east, exactly where the records describe." His voice was calm, educated, and unlike that of the rough hillmen surrounding him. The old kings concealed more than treasure beneath these hills. The leader folded his arms. "And you are certain these writings speak truth?" The cloaked scholar met his gaze without flinching. "I have spent 20 years studying the forgotten archives of the North. The Rangers preserved much, but they did not preserve everything." He allowed the words to settle before adding, "The refuge you seek was sealed by the last princes of Arthedain before Fornost fell. If we open it, we shall possess roads no army remembers." Several of the gathered men exchanged eager looks, while others remained visibly uncertain. None questioned the scholar further. Baranor slowly withdrew from the crack in the wall and rejoined Hendrik beneath the shelter of an ancient yew. Every word was repeated in a whisper. The older ranger listened with complete stillness, but Baranor saw the tension gathering around his eyes. "A scholar," Hendrik murmured. "That explains the restored markers and the hidden passages." Corin glanced toward the barn, where muffled voices still continued. "Can we seize him tonight?" Hendrik looked across the dark fields, where armed sentries moved at regular intervals around the buildings. "No. If we fail, every camp in these hills will vanish before sunrise." As they prepared to slip away, the farmhouse door opened once more. The frightened woman stepped outside, carrying a lantern, escorted by one of the armed guards. She crossed to the well without speaking, filled a bucket, and returned toward the house. Just before entering, she deliberately let the lantern swing low beside the stone path. For a fleeting instant, its light revealed another ancient carving, almost hidden beneath moss at the base of the well. It was the white star of Elendel, scarcely visible after centuries of weather. The woman never looked toward the shadows where the rangers lay concealed. Yet Baranor understood the message. She was showing them that the farm itself had once been one of Arna's secret way stations, and that whatever the enemy sought beneath these hills was closer than any of them had imagined. The rangers withdrew before the changing of the watch, leaving the farm as quietly as they had come. No branch snapped beneath their boots, and no horse whinnied from the hidden copse where they had been left tethered. Only when the farm had disappeared behind rolling ground did Hendrik finally slow his pace. He looked back once toward the dark silhouette of the buildings, where a single lantern still glowed faintly through a shuttered window. "That woman has placed herself in great danger," he said. "If they suspect she has spoken to us without uttering a word, she will not be given a second chance." Baranor felt the weight of those words settle heavily upon him, for he knew they could not return recklessly without placing every innocent soul there in greater peril. They rode east before dawn, guided by the clues they had gathered from the scholar's conversation. The hills grew harsher with every mile, their slopes broken by jagged outcrops that rose like the ribs of buried giants. Heather gave way to coarse grass, and the scattered trees became twisted and stunted beneath the constant wind. Here the old kingdom had once maintained hidden roads linking lonely watchposts, though centuries of neglect had almost erased them from the land. Baranor searched constantly for signs carved into stone or concealed beneath moss. More than once he uncovered fragments of weathered markings that confirmed they still followed the forgotten routes of the Dunedain. Near midday, they came upon a narrow gorge where an ancient bridge had long since collapsed into the stream below. The remaining arch leaned at an impossible angle, its stones held together more by stubbornness than sound masonry. Hendrik dismounted and examined the ruined crossing without speaking. Fresh rope fibers clung to one broken pillar where a temporary line had recently been secured. Baranor climbed carefully down the rocky bank until he found boot prints preserved in damp sand beside the water. At least 30 men had crossed within the past few days, leading several pack horses laden with heavy burdens. They had rebuilt nothing. They had merely found another way across. Corin pointed toward the opposite cliff, where faint grooves scarred the stone. "There," he whispered. A narrow path had been cut into the rock face so cleverly that it remained invisible until viewed from precisely the right angle. Thick brush concealed its lower entrance, while loose stones had been scattered deliberately to disguise any sign of passage. Hendrik smiled without humor. "A ranger's road," he said. "Or it was. Long ago." Baranor understood immediately why the enemy had needed a scholar. No wandering outlaw could have discovered such a route through chance, alone. They crossed one at a time, leading the horses carefully along the hidden ledge above the rushing stream. The passage narrowed until the cliff pressed close enough that Baranor could touch cold stone with one hand while steadying his horse with the other. Below, white water crashed against jagged rocks, sending cool mist upward into the morning air. The crossing demanded complete concentration, leaving no room for hurried movement or careless thought. When they finally reached the opposite side, each man breathed more easily, though none spoke of the danger just past. Beyond the gorge, the land opened into a broad valley, scattered with the ruins of forgotten farmsteads, abandoned centuries before. Low stone walls divided empty fields where only wildflowers and tall grass now grew. Roofless cottages stood like broken teeth beneath the open sky, their hearths long cold and their doors reduced to rotting fragments. Yet among those silent remains, Baranor noticed subtle signs of recent passage. A gate hung upon fresh leather hinges. One well had been cleared of weeds. Ashes lay beneath the stones of an old fireplace, no more than 2 or 3 nights old. Hendrik motioned the others into the shell of a crumbling cottage while he observed the valley from a broken window. They waited in complete silence until movement appeared along the northern edge of the fields. A line of villagers emerged between the ruins, walking under the watch of armed escorts. There were perhaps 40 of them, men and women alike, carrying bundles of clothing and simple tools. No chains bound their hands, yet every face bore the same weary resignation. Several children walked close beside their mothers, glancing fearfully toward the strangers surrounding them. "They are not prisoners in the ordinary sense," Corin whispered. "Look how they carry their own belongings." Hendrik nodded grimly. "Because they believe they are being resettled rather than captured." Baranor watched one elderly man stumble upon uneven ground. Before he could fall, one of the guards stepped forward and helped him regain his footing instead of striking him. The gesture seemed almost kind until the old man quietly tried to turn back toward the south. 2 guards immediately blocked his way, speaking firmly until he lowered his head and resumed walking north with the others. The procession disappeared beyond another ridge, leaving the valley empty once more. Baranor remained crouched beside the broken wall, troubled by what he had witnessed. "Why move whole villages?" he asked. "If they seek labor, fear alone would keep people working." Hendrik rested his hand upon the ancient stone windowsill. "Because fear alone breeds rebellion. But promise frightened folk safety from imagined enemies, and many will follow willingly for a time." Corin looked toward the north, where the last figures had vanished. "They are telling them that the old shadow has returned." Hendrik answered quietly. "Yes, then they offer themselves as the only shield against it." They followed the trail cautiously until sunset, careful never to close the distance too quickly. At length they reached another ridge, overlooking a secluded basin hidden between steep hills. Fires burned there in orderly rows, their smoke rising through openings in cleverly woven coverings that concealed them from distant eyes. Rough wooden huts had been raised within the basin, surrounded not by walls but by watch posts placed along the surrounding heights. Villagers moved freely between the buildings under the supervision of armed men, cooking meals, drawing water, and repairing tools. From afar, it resembled the camp of settlers establishing a new home rather than captives held against their will. Baranor studied the scene with growing unease. Children played near a cooking fire, while several women baked bread upon flat stones. Men repaired fences and unloaded wagons arriving from hidden forest tracks. Yet no one approached the roads leading away from the camp. Those paths remained guarded at all hours. Hendrik quietly counted nearly 60 armed men stationed throughout the basin. "Too many for chance," he murmured. "Too organized for desperation." Corin looked toward a larger building near the center, where several riders had just arrived. "The scholar may be among them." As darkness deepened, one of the newcomers climbed onto a wagon and called the gathered villagers together. His voice carried clearly across the still evening air. "You have all seen the abandoned farms. You know what stalks these hills." Murmurs spread among the crowd. "The king's men are too few to defend every valley," he continued. "But here you will be safe until the northern roads are secured." Several villagers nodded uncertainly. Others remained silent, exchanging doubtful glances with neighbors they had known all their lives. Then another figure stepped beside the speaker. Even at that distance, Baranor recognized the cloaked scholar from the farm. He unrolled an old parchment before the assembly, though no one below could possibly read its faded script in the firelight. "These lands belonged to mighty kings before they were abandoned," he declared. "Their hidden strongholds still endure beneath the hills. We shall restore them, and no darkness shall ever threaten your children again." His words were measured and convincing, delivered with the confidence of a learned man who understood exactly how hope could be shaped into obedience. The villagers listened in silence. Hendik's jaw tightened as he watched. "He mixes truth with lies," the ranger said quietly. "There are hidden refuges beneath these hills. They were built by our fathers, but he twists their purpose." Baranor felt anger rise within him, not because the man spoke of old history, but because he stole the honor of those who had built those places to protect the innocent. Here, that same legacy was becoming a tool for deception. Looking over the peaceful-looking camp, Baranor realized the enemy was winning not by terror alone, but by offering frightened people a future carefully built upon the ruins of the past. The three companions remained upon the ridge long after the campfires had burned low, watching every path, every changing guard, and every lantern that moved through the basin below. Nothing in the camp resembled the disorder of brigands or desperate refugees. Watches changed at regular intervals. Wagons arrived according to a clear schedule. Even the distribution of food followed an orderly pattern, with families gathering in small groups beneath the direction of men who behaved more like overseers than soldiers. Baranor understood that discipline alone could hold such a place together, but discipline required leadership, supplies, and careful planning. None of those things appeared overnight. Hendrik finally lowered the small brass spyglass he carried beneath his cloak. "We have counted nearly 80 armed men," he said quietly. "There will be more beyond these hills, and they are gathering faster than we can follow." Corin glanced toward the southern horizon, where the king's authority still held firm. "Then we ride for Bree and summon every ranger we can find." The older man remained silent for a long moment before answering. "If we leave now, they may abandon this camp before help arrives. Whatever lies beneath these hills will disappear with them, and we will spend another year searching empty valleys." Baranor knew the choice before them was difficult. They needed proof as much as they needed reinforcements. Near midnight, a horn sounded once from the center of the basin. It was a low note, neither an alarm nor a call to arms, but a signal expected by those who heard it. Several guards immediately took up lanterns fitted with narrow shutters, allowing only thin beams of light to escape. One after another they walked toward the northern edge of the camp, where a steep hillside rose above the valley floor. Villagers remained in their huts, while only selected armed men followed the lantern-bearers into the darkness. Baranor counted 24 before the last disappeared among the rocks. "There," Hendrik whispered, pointing toward the slope. "That is where they go each night." The rangers withdrew from the ridge and circled carefully through the surrounding woodland until they overlooked the northern hillside from another angle. Progress was slow. Thick brambles caught at their cloaks, while loose stones threatened to betray every step. More than once they froze as sentries passed only a short distance away, speaking in low voices before continuing along their patrols. At last they reached a cluster of wind-twisted pines overlooking a narrow clearing hidden from the camp below. The clearing appeared empty until one of the lantern-bearers approached a sheer wall of grey stone. He placed his hand beneath an overhanging ledge and pulled something hidden from view. With a deep grinding sound, a section of the cliff slowly shifted inward, revealing a broad passage descending beneath the hill. Baranor felt his breath catch despite himself. This was no natural cave. Massive stone blocks framed the entrance, their joints fitted so precisely that centuries had hidden them almost perfectly beneath moss and weathered rock. The builders of Arnor had possessed remarkable skill. Men carrying tools disappeared into the passage, while others rolled carts laden with timber, rope, barrels, and iron fittings across the threshold. Hendrik watched every movement with growing concern. "They are not merely exploring," he murmured. "They are restoring the place." Baranor studied the steady flow of supplies. Nothing entered carelessly. Every wagon carried materials chosen for a purpose. Whatever waited beneath the hill was becoming the center of the entire operation. Once the entrance had swallowed the last cart, the hidden door slowly closed again until the cliff appeared untouched. Only 2 guards remained outside, seated beside a small fire carefully concealed beneath an overhanging shelf of stone. Hendrik looked toward Baranor. No words were needed. The younger ranger understood immediately. Someone would have to enter those tunnels before dawn. They waited patiently until the guards settled into the dull routine of the long night. One wandered a short distance away to relieve himself beside a clump of juniper. The other remained seated with his cloak drawn tightly around his shoulders against the cooling air. Hendrik moved first, crossing open ground with astonishing silence despite his years. Before the seated guard sensed danger, the ranger had already covered his mouth and pulled him backward into the shadows. Baranor reached the second guard moments later as he returned, catching him from behind before he could cry out. Both men were quickly bound and gagged beneath thick brush where they would not easily be discovered. The hidden mechanism took only a few moments to find. Hendrik pressed against the same concealed lever the lantern-bearer had used earlier. Stone groaned softly as the entrance opened once more, releasing a breath of cool air scented with damp earth and old masonry. Baranor stepped inside first, lantern hooded tightly so that only enough light escaped to guide his footing. The passage descended at a gentle angle, its floor paved with ancient flagstones, worn smooth by long-forgotten feet. Water dripped steadily somewhere ahead, echoing through the darkness with hollow persistence. The deeper they traveled, the more the craftsmanship of the old kingdom revealed itself. Carved pillars supported broad ceilings, blackened by age but still remarkably sound. Channels cut beside the walls carried clear water downhill toward unseen cisterns. At regular intervals, faded carvings marked crossroads leading into other tunnels, now blocked by deliberate collapses of stone. Baranor paused before one weathered relief depicting the white tree beneath 7 stars. Although chipped and scarred, it remained unmistakably the work of the Dunedain. He felt both admiration and sorrow. Their ancestors had built these halls to preserve hope during war, never imagining they would one day shelter deceivers. The sound of voices reached them long before the light did. Hendrik extinguished the lantern completely, and the 3 men advanced through darkness until a warm glow flickered around the next bend. They crouched behind a square pillar and looked into a vast underground chamber. The room had once served as a great meeting hall. Stone benches lined the walls, while a broad table stood at its center, beneath newly lit lamps. Dozens of workers carried beams, cleared fallen rubble, and repaired cracked masonry under the direction of experienced craftsmen. At the far end of the chamber stood the cloaked scholar, speaking with the same commander Baranor had seen at the farm. Between them rested a large parchment spread across the ancient table. "The western galleries remain blocked," the commander reported. "It will take another week to clear them." The scholar nodded calmly. "That matters little. We need only the central passages. Once the northern entrance is opened, supplies may move unseen from valley to valley, regardless of who watches the roads above." He placed one finger upon the map. "When the work is complete, these hills will belong to us." The commander folded his arms thoughtfully. "And the people?" he asked. The scholar smiled faintly, though there was little warmth in the expression. "Fear has already done most of the work. Soon they will believe this refuge saved them from dangers beyond the king's reach. Once they depend upon us for food, shelter, and protection, loyalty will follow. He rolled up the parchment with careful hands before adding in a quieter voice. By the time Elisar learns the truth, the North will have accepted new masters without a single battle. Baranor felt anger tighten his chest, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still. Every word confirmed what they had suspected. This was no rising of ancient darkness. It was a patient conquest built upon deception, using the forgotten defenses of Arnor against the very kingdom they had once protected. Hendash lightly touched his arm, reminding him that knowledge carried safely home would accomplish far more than any desperate attack. Yet as Baranor prepared to withdraw, his eyes fell upon something resting against the far wall of the chamber. It was an old banner, carefully unfolded upon a wooden frame, bearing the silver crown of Arnor. Someone was painstakingly repairing it, not to honor the lost kingdom, but to place it beneath the command of men who had no rightful claim to it. Baranor could not draw his eyes away from the ancient banner. Even beneath layers of dust and careful repairs, the silver crown remained unmistakable, woven long ago by hands that had served the kings of Arna. Time had dimmed its colors, and several tiers had been neatly stitched closed with fresh thread. The craftsman working upon it handled the cloth with genuine care, pausing often to smooth the faded fabric before returning to his needle. That reverence disturbed Baranor more than open mockery would have done. These men were not destroying the past, they were claiming it. Hendrik gently touched Baranor's shoulder, and the three companions began to withdraw from the chamber with the same care that had brought them there. Every step was measured. Every breath seemed louder than it truly was. They had nearly reached the last bend in the passage when the faint scrape of leather echoed behind them. Baranor turned slowly enough to avoid sudden movement. A lone worker carrying a bundle of timber had entered the corridor from a side passage and was walking directly toward them. The man halted abruptly, narrowing his eyes into the darkness where the rangers crouched behind a pillar. For a heartbeat, neither side moved. Then the worker shifted the timber from one shoulder and quietly said, "Who is there?" His voice held uncertainty rather than alarm, but another few steps would reveal them completely. Hendrik reacted before the moment could be lost. He stepped from the shadows with astonishing speed, covering the man's mouth while Baranor caught the falling bundle before it struck the stone floor. Corrin secured the man's arms, and together they eased him silently behind the pillar. The captive struggled only briefly before recognizing that his attackers had no wish to kill him. Hendrik loosened his grip just enough for the man to breathe. "If you remain silent, no harm will come to you," he whispered. The worker nodded rapidly, fear replacing resistance. He appeared little older than Baranor himself, his rough hands marked by honest labor rather than years of fighting. Once certain he would not shout, Hendrik slowly removed his hand. The young man swallowed hard before speaking in a trembling voice. "Your rangers!" Baranor exchanged a quick glance with Hendrik. The man had not guessed wildly. He had recognized them. "How?" Baranor asked quietly. The worker looked from one face to another before answering. "My grandfather served the Rangers during the last years before King Elisar was crowned. He taught me how your people move." His voice remained low, barely audible over the distant sounds of hammers deeper within the refuge. "If they find me speaking to you, they'll hang me as a spy." Hendrik studied him carefully. "What is your name?" "Edric," the young man replied without hesitation. "I came from a village west of the Weather Hills." Baranor frowned. "Willingly?" Edric lowered his eyes. At first. The single answer carried more weight than a long explanation. He drew a slow breath before continuing. They told us raiders were gathering in the north. They promised shelter until the danger passed. They brought food when our harvest failed. Many believed them because no enemy ever came to prove them wrong. The distant ringing of iron continued through the halls, while Edric spoke in hurried whispers. He explained that families had been encouraged to settle in the hidden camps, where they received work repairing old roads and clearing forgotten tunnels. No one was beaten. No one was starved. Those who questioned too much simply found themselves watched more closely than before. Travelers were discouraged from leaving until the supposed northern threat had passed. Weeks became months. Gradually, the camps became entire communities, whose people no longer knew whom to trust outside the valleys where they lived. Some tried to leave, Edric admitted, rubbing his bound wrists against the rough stone. Most were brought back unharmed. After that, they stopped trying. Baranor looked steadily into the young man's eyes. And what of the villages that were emptied? Edric hesitated before answering. Some came willingly. Others were persuaded. They always chose respected elders first. Once the village leaders agreed to travel north, the rest followed. Hendrik closed his eyes briefly. There had been no magic, no ancient curse, only careful manipulation of ordinary fears. Corin leaned closer. Who commands all this? Edric glanced nervously toward the chamber they had left behind. The soldiers answer to Captain Hervold. The scholar answers to no one. His voice dropped still lower. They call him Master Salon. The name meant nothing to Baranor, but Hendrik stiffened almost imperceptibly. The older ranger's eyes narrowed in sudden recognition. Ceylon, he repeated quietly, as though testing the memory aloud. Baranor waited until they had moved farther down the passage before asking the question. Hendrik kept walking while he answered. Years ago, there was a scholar in Anuminas by that name. He spent decades studying records brought from the ruins of Fornost and the old keeps of Arthedain. Few knew the northern kingdoms better. Corun frowned. Why would such a man abandon the king's service? Hendrik shook his head slowly. I do not know that he did, but I remember hearing whispers that he argued constantly with those who governed the restoration of the north. He believed the old strength of Arna should be rebuilt quickly, by firm rule rather than patient settlement. They reached the entrance corridor without encountering another soul. The hidden stone door remained slightly open where they had left it, allowing a faint draught of cool night air to drift inward. Before stepping outside, Hendrik turned once more toward Edric. Will you come with us? He asked. The young man stared at the darkness beyond the doorway, then back toward the warm light deeper within the refuge. Conflict crossed his face with painful clarity. My mother and little sister are in the camp, he answered at last. If I vanish, they will suffer in my place. Baranor understood immediately. Leaving was not merely an escape. It was abandoning those he loved. Then remain, Baranor said quietly. But remember this. The king has not forgotten these lands. Edric looked at him with an expression halfway between hope and disbelief. Hendrik untied the cords binding his wrists completely. If you can safely learn where Ceylon intends to move next, leave a ranger's sign upon any old waystone you find. We will be watching. Edric nodded once. I swear it. The rangers slipped back into the night, sealing the hidden entrance behind them exactly as they had found it. Dawn remained several hours away, and the hills lay silent beneath a sky filled with cold stars. They had scarcely climbed halfway toward the ridge when Hendrik suddenly dropped to one knee beside a patch of soft earth. Fresh hoofprints crossed the trail, deeper than those left by ordinary riders. Baranor crouched beside him. "How many?" he whispered. Hendrik counted silently before answering. "At least 30 horses. They passed while we were below." The tracks led away from the refuge, not toward the camps they already knew, but farther east into country none of the old maps had marked clearly. Several wagons had accompanied the riders, their wheels cutting deep grooves through the damp ground. Baranor looked toward the faint paling of the eastern horizon, where the first hint of dawn touched the sky. Whatever Sauron had begun beneath the hills was spreading faster than they had feared. And now another column, large enough to found an entirely new settlement, was already moving toward a destination still hidden somewhere within the forgotten lands of old Arna. The rangers followed the fresh tracks as dawn slowly spread across the eastern sky, turning the mist that filled the valleys pale silver. They dared not ride quickly, for the ground ahead was open and offered little cover beyond scattered stands of pine. The hoofprints remained easy to follow after the night's dampness, pressed deep into the soft earth by heavily laden wagons. Baranor noted that several horses had stumbled on the steeper slopes, suggesting the loads they carried were considerable. Whatever Sauron had sent eastward was too valuable to risk moving in haste, and that knowledge gave the rangers a narrow advantage. By mid-morning, the trail entered country that Baranor had never seen, though he had studied many maps of the north during his training. The hills became higher and more broken, their sides marked by long scars where ancient landslides had exposed pale stone beneath the grass. Here and there stood lonely pillars carved by forgotten hands, their weathered surfaces almost erased by centuries of wind and rain. Hendrik dismounted beside one such stone and carefully brushed away a layer of moss with the edge of his glove. Beneath it appeared the faint outline of 7 stars surrounding a single crown. "Another guide marker," he said quietly. "Sauron has uncovered nearly every hidden sign that once guarded these roads." Corin looked uneasily toward the empty landscape stretching ahead. "How could one man learn so much?" he asked. Hendrik remained crouched beside the pillar, tracing the ancient carving with thoughtful fingers. Knowledge survives in strange places. Some records were preserved in Anuminas after the king returned. Others lay forgotten in private collections, abandoned monasteries, or ruined keeps. A patient scholar might spend half a lifetime gathering scattered fragments. He stood slowly, his expression darkening. "What troubles me is not that Sauron found them. It is that no one realized what he intended before he vanished." The tracks descended into a broad valley where the remains of an old road emerged beneath the grass. Although broken in many places, the stonework still showed the skill of Númenórean builders. The wagons had followed it for nearly a mile before leaving the roadway near a cluster of ancient beeches. There, the rangers found something unexpected. The column had halted long enough to make repairs. Broken wheel spokes lay discarded beside fresh axe chips, while a small fire pit still held warm ashes beneath a covering of loose soil. Baranor knelt beside the remains and held one hand above them. "Less than an hour," he murmured. Without another word, they urged their horses onward. The trail climbed gradually through the trees until distant voices drifted back upon the wind. Hendrik immediately signaled for silence. The rangers left their mounts hidden among dense undergrowth and continued on foot, moving from tree to tree until the forest opened upon a wide clearing. Below them stretched another caravan unlike any Baranor had expected. Nearly 50 wagons stood arranged in orderly lines, while families unloaded furniture, farming tools, sacks of grain, and caged chickens. Children laughed as they chased one another between the carts, watched by mothers who seemed tired but no longer openly afraid. The armed escort remained present, though its manner had changed. Soldiers helped lift barrels from wagons and guided oxen toward freshly marked fields. Several men were already driving wooden stakes into the ground, measuring streets for what would become a permanent village. Beyond them, carpenters raised the framework of larger buildings using timber cut from the surrounding forest. Everything suggested preparation for long settlement rather than temporary refuge. Baranor stared in disbelief. "He is building towns," he whispered. "Not camps." Hendrik watched the scene for several minutes before answering. "And every settlement lies upon one of the old hidden roads." Corin followed the older ranger's gaze toward a rocky hillside overlooking the clearing. At its base stood a massive stone arch, almost swallowed by ivy, scarcely visible unless one knew where to look. "Another entrance," he said. Hendrik nodded. Another refuge, another crossroads beneath the hills. The realization settled over them all with uncomfortable clarity. Ceylon was not restoring a single fortress. He was rebuilding an entire forgotten network beneath northern Arna. As they observed the clearing, a horn sounded from its southern edge. Riders approached at a measured pace, surrounding a covered wagon drawn by 4 powerful horses. The workers immediately paused, removing their caps as the wagon passed. Captain Hervold rode beside it, speaking quietly with someone concealed behind heavy curtains. When the wagon halted near the stone arch, the curtains were drawn aside from within. Ceylon stepped into the sunlight, carrying a bundle of rolled parchments beneath one arm. The scholar looked older than Baranor had first believed. His beard was streaked with grey, and deep lines marked his face beneath thoughtful eyes that missed very little. Yet nothing about him suggested cruelty or madness. He moved with calm confidence, greeting craftsmen by name and asking detailed questions about stonework, water supplies, and crop fields. Several children even smiled as he passed, and he paused long enough to return their greetings with genuine warmth. Baranor found the sight deeply unsettling. Evil, he realized, did not always wear a harsh face. Ceylon climbed onto a large boulder where the settlers could see him clearly. "Friends," he called, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "Today you begin something greater than yourselves." Men and women gathered to listen, while labor slowed throughout the valley. For too long these lands have remained empty, because fear ruled where hope should have lived. We will restore what was abandoned. We will guard these roads as our fathers once did. And our children shall inherit a north that no enemy will ever threaten again. His words drew scattered applause from the weary settlers. Baranor listened carefully, waiting for the lie that would expose the man completely. Yet Ceylon spoke mostly of true things. The north had indeed suffered. The roads had indeed fallen into ruin. Arnor had once guarded these lands against terrible enemies. Only gradually did the falsehood emerge, woven so naturally among honest statements that many listeners would never question it. "The king sits far away in the south," Ceylon continued. "His heart may be noble, but no ruler can protect people he never sees. Therefore we must become our own guardians, our own strength, and our own future." Hendrik's expression hardened. "There," he whispered. "That is the poison." Baranor understood at once. Ceylon never openly denied King Elisar's authority. Instead, he encouraged people to believe that they no longer needed it. Fear of forgotten dangers became the foundation upon which a separate loyalty could quietly grow. It was a patient rebellion disguised as self-reliance, cloaked in the language of duty and restoration. The speech ended, and work resumed with renewed energy. Ceylon disappeared through the ancient arch accompanied by Captain Herwold and several trusted followers. Baranor followed them with his eyes until the darkness swallowed them from sight. Then something caught his attention. Upon a distant ridge beyond the clearing, a lone figure stood motionless among the rocks, half concealed by wind-bent pines. The man wore the grey cloak of a ranger. For one hopeful instant, Baranor believed reinforcements had finally arrived. But the stranger neither signaled nor approached. Instead, after watching the valley for several moments, he turned and vanished into the wilderness as silently as he had appeared, leaving Baranor uncertain whether he had witnessed an ally or someone serving a far more dangerous purpose. For several long moments, Baranor continued watching the ridge where the grey-cloaked figure had vanished. The wind stirred the tops of the pines, but nothing else moved among the rocks. He knew too well that not every man who wore a weathered cloak belonged to the Rangers of the North. Hunters, travelers, and even outlaws often dressed in similar colors to escape notice upon the hills. Yet there had been something in the stranger's posture that troubled him. The man had stood with the quiet stillness of one trained to observe without being seen, a habit learned only through long discipline. Corran leaned closer. "Did you know him?" he whispered. Baranor slowly shook his head. No. But he watched the settlement instead of the roads. Hendrik remained thoughtful, his eyes fixed upon the empty ridge. "There are still rangers who patrol alone for months at a time. Some I have not seen since before the king was crowned." He paused before adding, "Or it could be someone who wishes us to believe exactly that." None of them liked the second possibility. The three companions withdrew into thicker woodland before discussing what they had seen. They dared not linger where scouts from the settlement might discover them. Once hidden beneath towering beeches, Hendrik spread a rough map across a fallen log and marked every refuge, tunnel, and settlement they had uncovered during the past days. The pattern had grown unmistakable. Ceylon was establishing control over a chain of hidden valleys connected by the ancient roads beneath the hills. Each new settlement strengthened the next, allowing supplies, people, and messages to travel almost entirely unseen. "We have enough to take before the king," Corran said at last. "If we ride south now, armies can march before winter." Hendrik did not answer immediately. Instead, he traced one finger toward the eastern edge of the map, where several old markings ended abruptly. "Almost enough," he replied. "We still do not know what lies at the heart of all this." Baranor understood the thought before the words came. The settlements, the tunnels, and the hidden roads all served a greater purpose. Men did not build such a network merely to govern a handful of valleys. As the afternoon wore on, they circled eastward, keeping well beyond the reach of Ceylon's patrols. The land grew increasingly wild. Ancient forests covered the slopes, broken only by steep ravines where streams rushed over polished stone. Signs of ordinary travelers disappeared entirely. Even deer trails became scarce among the tangled undergrowth. Hendrik moved with increasing caution, often stopping to study broken branches or distant birds before continuing. Twice they found fresh boot prints leading away from the hidden settlement. Both times the tracks belonged to only one rider. Toward evening, they reached the crest of a long ridge overlooking another valley, unlike any they had yet encountered. Here the forest had been deliberately cleared in a broad circle around the ruins of an ancient fortress. Only fragments of its walls remained above ground, their stones blackened by fires long extinguished. Around the ruins, hundreds of laborers worked with picks, shovels, and carts, removing centuries of fallen earth. From a distance, the place resembled an enormous quarry, alive with steady movement from dawn until dusk. Baranor counted more men than he had seen in all the previous settlements combined. Some cut timber, others shaped fresh stone blocks with careful precision. Blacksmiths labored beneath temporary shelters, where sparks rose into the fading light. Long lines of wagons arrived throughout the afternoon, carrying iron, food, rope, and barrels of pitch. Yet what drew Baranor's attention most was not the work itself, but its direction. Every effort centered upon the ruined fortress at the valley's heart. Hendach lay silently behind a screen of fern while studying the ancient walls through his spyglass. After several minutes, he lowered it with unusual care. "I know this place," he said quietly. "Or rather, I know what it once was." Corrin looked toward the broken keep. "Which fortress?" The older ranger hesitated before answering. "Not one named in the great tales. This was a supply fortress, built during the final wars against Angmar. Its duty was to guard the underground roads leading west toward Fornost." He looked once more through the glass. "If Ceylon restores it, he will command every hidden passage we have found." As twilight settled across the valley, a horn echoed from within the ruins. The labor ceased almost at once. Men gathered in orderly companies while officers moved among them with practiced efficiency. Baranor expected another speech like the one given earlier, but instead, a section of the excavated ground slowly descended. What he had taken for an ordinary courtyard revealed itself to be an enormous stone platform lowered by hidden machinery beneath the earth. The workers disappeared below in groups, carrying tools and lanterns into depths unseen. Hendach drew a slow breath. "That mechanism should not still function," he murmured. "It has stood abandoned for more than 1,000 years." Baranor watched the great platform descend until darkness swallowed it completely. The engineering alone was astonishing. Generations of neglect should have left it buried beyond recovery. Yet somehow Ceylon's men had restored it well enough to carry dozens of workers beneath the fortress. Night fell fully before the rangers dared move closer. They descended through the forest with painstaking care until they reached the edge of the cleared ground. There they discovered something unexpected. Fresh-cut logs had been stacked beside a temporary workshop, but hidden beneath one pile lay several broken stone fragments recently discarded during excavation. Baranor carefully turned one over and brushed away loose dirt. His breath caught. The fragment bore part of an inscription written in the graceful script of the Dunedain. Though broken, enough remained to read several words. "The archives, preserved, the line of Isildur." Hendach immediately knelt beside him. Together they examined the remaining fragments until the older ranger's face grew pale beneath the lantern's faint glow. "These are not ordinary foundations," he whispered. "This fortress protected one of the northern archives." Corrin looked from one man to the other. "Archives?" Hendach nodded gravely. "Copies of royal records, military reports, genealogies, maps, the knowledge of the northern kingdom." His voice grew quieter still. "If Ceylon reaches them before we do, he may possess every surviving record the Dunedain hid during the fall of Arnor." Baranor stared toward the dark fortress, where hundreds of lanterns now flickered beneath the earth like stars buried beneath stone. Until this moment, he had believed Ceylon sought only hidden roads and defensible strongholds. Now the truth appeared far greater. The scholar was searching for the memory of the kingdom itself. Every map, every forgotten record, every secret preserved against the ruin of war might soon fall into his hands, and if that knowledge could persuade enough people that he alone understood the true inheritance of Arnor, then swords alone might never be enough to defeat him. The rangers remained hidden until the last traces of twilight faded from the western sky. Below them, the excavated fortress had become a place of measured activity rather than frantic labor. Lanterns glowed from newly uncovered chambers beneath the earth, their light rising through broken courtyards like stars trapped beneath ancient stone. Men crossed temporary bridges, carrying crates, tools, and bundles of parchment wrapped carefully against dampness. Baranor watched each movement with growing unease, for the work no longer resembled simple restoration. It resembled the deliberate reopening of something that had been sealed with great purpose many centuries before. Hendersh studied the fortress through his spyglass one final time before lowering it into its leather case. "We go inside," he said quietly. Corran looked at him in surprise, though not disbelief. "There are hundreds below." The older ranger nodded once. "Then we avoid hundreds. We need only one chamber, and if fortune still favors the north, we will find it before Ceylon does." Baranor felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before dangerous work, yet he welcomed the clarity it brought. The time for watching from distant hills had ended. They descended after midnight, using a narrow drainage channel that curved beneath fallen masonry before reaching the outer wall. Thick ivy concealed a crack where enormous stones had shifted apart over countless winters. Baranor slipped through first, feeling rough stones scrape against his shoulders as he entered the ruined fortress. The air inside carried the smell of damp mortar, old dust, and freshly cut timber. Somewhere deeper within the ruins, hammers still struck with slow, patient rhythm. The workers had not rested, though the hour was late. The rangers advanced through collapsed corridors where shattered pillars lay half buried beneath centuries of fallen earth. Moonlight reached only in scattered patches through broken roofs, leaving long stretches of darkness between them. Baranor paused beside an ancient doorway whose carved lintel still bore faded stars surrounding a crowned tree. The stone had cracked almost completely through, yet the carving survived. He rested one hand briefly upon it before moving on, struck by the thought that generations of his own people had once walked these same halls while the kingdom still endured. A faint glow appeared ahead beyond a fallen arch. The companions crouched behind a pile of broken masonry and looked into what had once been a large record hall. Shelves carved directly into the stone walls stood empty, where scrolls and books had long ago been removed or destroyed. Several laborers carefully cleared debris from the floor, while two scribes copied faded inscriptions preserved upon the walls themselves. Every mark was recorded with astonishing care. Ceylon intended to lose nothing that history had spared. The scholar himself stood near the center of the chamber beside Captain Herwold. Between them rested a heavy stone slab recently lifted from the floor by ropes and wooden braces. Beneath it yawned a square shaft descending into darkness. Cool air drifted upward from unseen depths, carrying the stale scent of sealed chambers undisturbed for centuries. Ceylon looked down into the opening with unmistakable satisfaction. The builders concealed it exactly as the final records described, he said. They feared the archives above would one day fall, so they buried the most valuable collections even deeper. Hervold folded his arms while peering into the shaft. And if the records were wrong? Ceylon allowed himself the faintest smile. Then I have wasted 20 years. Fortunately, they were not. He accepted a lantern from one of the workers and turned toward a group of carefully chosen men already waiting with ropes and climbing gear. Only those I have named will descend. No one touches a single chest until I examine its seals. His calm authority left no room for argument. Hendersh leaned close enough for only Baranor and Corran to hear. If those lower archives survive, they may contain copies thought lost forever after the fall of Fornost. His voice carried both wonder and concern. Some knowledge belongs in wise hands. some does not. Baranor understood. Maps showing forgotten defenses, hidden refuges, supply routes, and signals known only to the Dunedain could allow Ceylon to strengthen every settlement under his influence before the king even understood the scale of the threat. As Ceylon and his chosen party disappeared down the ropes, most of the laborers returned to their work elsewhere in the fortress. The great hall gradually emptied until only 4 guards remained near the shaft. Hendush studied their movements patiently, waiting until 2 wandered into an adjoining passage to inspect newly uncovered rooms. "Now," he whispered. The rangers slipped silently across the chamber, keeping close to the walls where deep shadows hid their passage. They reached the open shaft without drawing notice. Baranor looked downward and saw lantern light flickering far below. The descent was deeper than he had expected, perhaps 60 feet or more. Hendush secured the rope with practiced hands and began climbing into the darkness. Corran followed, and Baranor came last, descending carefully, while the stone walls echoed faintly with distant voices below. The shaft opened into a remarkable chamber, unlike anything Baranor had imagined. The room was perfectly dry despite its age, its walls lined with massive stone alcoves, sealed by fitted slabs bearing the emblems of the northern princes. Bronze lamps, recently lit by Ceylon's party, cast warm light across rows of heavy cedar chests, bound with green-black iron that showed almost no trace of rust. The builders had chosen this place with extraordinary care. Even after more than 1,000 years, the air remained cool and still, preserving everything within. Ceylon knelt before the nearest chest with almost reverent concentration. Using a small bronze key taken from a leather pouch around his neck, he unlocked the ancient fastening and slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay bundles of parchment wrapped in oilcloth, each bearing neat labels written in the elegant hand of long-dead scribes. The scholar carefully unrolled the first document. His composed expression changed for the first time since Baranor had seen him. Wonder shone plainly across his face. "They survived," Ceylon whispered, almost to himself. "Every one of them." Herwold stepped closer. "What have you found?" The scholar scarcely looked up from the parchment. "The Western Defense records, inventories of the hidden refuges, correspondence from the final kings of Arthedain." His hands trembled ever so slightly, not with greed, but with the excitement of a man whose life's work had suddenly become real. Then he reached deeper into the chest and withdrew a sealed leather portfolio marked with the royal device of the House of Isildur. He stared at the untouched seal for several long moments before saying quietly, "This should not exist." Hidden behind a row of unopened chests, Baranor exchanged a glance with Hendush. Whatever rested inside that royal portfolio had surprised even Ceylon, and as the scholar carefully broke the ancient wax seal, Baranor realized that the next few moments might reveal the true reason this forgotten archive had been hidden so deeply beneath the hills all those centuries ago. The ancient wax seal broke with a dry, brittle crack that echoed softly through the underground chamber. Ceylon opened the leather portfolio with hands that, despite all his composure, betrayed the excitement of a lifetime's pursuit. Captain Herwold leaned forward, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the bronze lamps, while the men behind them waited in complete silence. Even the distant sounds of excavation seemed to fade, as though the fortress itself had paused to witness what had survived the fall of a kingdom. Baranor watched from behind the cedar chests without daring to blink. Whatever lay inside had remained unseen since the final years of Arthedain. Ceylon unfolded the first parchment with extraordinary care. His eyes moved rapidly across the elegant script, before slowing, then returning to the beginning as though he doubted his own reading. A long silence followed. Hervold shifted impatiently before asking, "What does it say?" The scholar answered without lifting his gaze. "It is not what I expected." He turned another page, then another. "These are not military instructions. They are letters exchanged between King Arvedui and his council during the last winter before the fall of Fornost." Hervold frowned openly. "Letters?" Ceylon nodded absent-mindedly. "Private correspondence, preserved because the council feared none would survive." His voice became quieter as he continued reading. "They speak of the hidden refugees, but not as places from which to rule." He paused once more, his brow slowly furrowing. "They were never intended to become new kingdoms." The words hung in the still air. Baranor felt Hendrik beside him become utterly motionless. The scholar continued reading, his confident expression giving way to thoughtful uncertainty. "The refuges were built only to preserve life until rightful authority could be restored," he murmured. "Every governor appointed to these places swore an oath that no lord, captain, or steward would ever claim the crown through possession of them." He carefully laid one parchment aside and opened another. They feared exactly what happened after the fall of Numenor, that ambitious men might mistake guardianship for kingship. Hervold's face hardened. "Old men worrying over shadows," he said dismissively. Ceylon did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached deeper into the portfolio and withdrew another document bearing the royal seal. This one appeared shorter, written in a firmer hand. He read it silently, before closing his eyes for a brief moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the certainty it had held above ground. "This is a decree from Arvedui himself." Hervold folded his arms. "Then read it." The scholar hesitated only a heartbeat before obeying. "If these halls endure beyond our days," Ceylon read aloud, "let those who find them remember this above all things. They were built not to preserve power, but to preserve the people until the king's house should rise again. Whosoever claims dominion through these refuges shall betray both honor and the trust placed in him by the faithful." Silence settled heavily over the chamber. The words seemed almost to linger beneath the stone ceiling after the scholar's voice had faded. Hervold broke the silence with an impatient laugh that sounded strangely out of place. "Dead kings often write noble words. Living men must rule the world they inherit." Ceylon slowly lowered the parchment. "You do not understand." "Then explain it," the captain replied. The scholar looked toward the rows of unopened chests surrounding them. "Everything I have built rests upon the belief that I am restoring the intention of the old kingdom." He touched the document gently. "If this decree is genuine, then the founders of these refugees intended precisely the opposite." For the first time since Baranor had laid eyes upon him, Ceylon appeared uncertain. His gaze wandered across the ancient chamber, as though seeing it anew, the carefully fitted stones, the untouched chests, the preserved records. All had endured because generations before had refused to use them for personal ambition. Hendrik leaned close enough that only Baranor could hear him. "Truth has found him before we did." His voice held no triumph, only quiet sadness. Whether he accepts it is another matter. Captain Herwold's patience finally broke. "Enough of forgotten oaths," he said sharply. "The people follow us now. The settlements are growing. The king has neglected these lands for decades, while we have rebuilt them with our own hands." Ceylon looked steadily at him. "King Elisar has ruled scarcely 20 years over a realm shattered for 1,000. Herwold waved the objection aside. The North needed strength, not promises. He stepped closer to the scholar, lowering his voice. You showed us these roads. You gave frightened people hope. Do not lose your courage because of a few faded letters. Baranor studied the captain carefully. Until now, Herwold had seemed merely a capable soldier obeying a learned leader. At this moment, the balance shifted before his eyes. Ceylon hesitated. Herwold did not. The captain had already committed himself completely to the new order, taking shape beneath these hills. Ancient records mattered only if they strengthened his purpose. If they stood against it, they became obstacles to be ignored. Ceylon gathered the royal letters together with visible care. These documents leave this chamber under my protection, he said quietly. No copies will be made until I have examined every record. Herwold's expression remained unreadable. As you wish. Yet something in his tone caused Baranor's instincts to tighten. The captain agreed too easily. His eyes lingered not upon the letters themselves, but upon the scholar who now held them. The moment stretched only a heartbeat before distant footsteps echoed from the top of the access shaft. One of the guards called down urgently. "Captain!" The voice carried unmistakable alarm. Riders have arrived from the western settlements. Herwold looked upward. What news? The answer came back, breathless, through the stone-lined shaft. One of the camps has emptied during the night. More than 30 families are gone. Every man in the chamber turned toward the opening above. Baranor exchanged a quick glance with Hendrik, both understanding the significance immediately. Someone had escaped. Whether by chance, by courage, or through Edric's help, an entire group of settlers had somehow slipped beyond Ceylon's control. And if even one of them reached the rangers or the king's officials in Bree, the carefully woven deception that had taken months to build might already be beginning to unravel. The report struck the chamber like a sudden gust through a long, sealed hall. Captain Herwold climbed the rope ladder without another word, moving with the speed of a soldier who sensed danger before fully understanding it. Ceylon remained where he stood, the portfolio of royal letters still resting in his hands. He stared after the captain for several moments before carefully wrapping the documents once more in their protective leather cover. Around them, the workers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering quietly as uncertainty spread among men who had grown accustomed to orderly command. Baranor watched every face from the shelter of the cedar chests, searching for any sign that the scholar intended to destroy the records. Instead, Ceylon placed them back inside the chest with remarkable care and locked the heavy lid. Hendrik leaned close enough that his breath barely stirred the air. "His heart is wavering," he whispered. Baranor kept his eyes fixed upon the scholar. "Will that stop him?" The older ranger gave the slightest shake of his head. "Not by itself. A man may recognize his error and still cling to it, because too many have already followed him." Corran quietly nodded in agreement. "Then we must reach those who escaped before Herwold does." Hendrik's expression remained calm, but Baranor knew the decision had already been made. The hidden archive could wait no longer. Living people came first. Ceylon finally climbed from the underground chamber, leaving only a handful of guards to secure the archive. The rangers waited patiently until the sounds above had faded, before slipping from their hiding place. Hendrik approached the nearest cedar chest without touching it, studying its construction with the deep respect one might show a tomb. "We leave everything exactly as we found it," he said, quietly. "These records belong to the king, not to us." Baranor agreed without hesitation. They had entered as witnesses, not thieves. Even now, with priceless knowledge lying only an arm's length away, no ranger of Arna would dishonor the trust placed in those ancient vaults. The climb back to the fortress above proved slower than the descent. Voices echoed through nearby corridors as messengers hurried between officers carrying fresh orders. By the time the Rangers reached the ruined courtyard, the entire fortress had awakened before dawn. Riders mounted waiting horses, while wagons were hastily loaded with supplies. Smiths abandoned their forges to sharpen weapons instead, and scouts disappeared into the surrounding forests in every direction. Herwold had responded with swift efficiency. Whatever families had escaped, he intended to recover them before they reached the southern roads. The companions withdrew through the same narrow breach by which they had entered, emerging into the cold morning air just as the eastern horizon began to brighten. Mist filled the valley below, softening the outlines of the workers moving among the ruins. From their concealed position within the forest, they watched columns of mounted men ride west in disciplined groups, each following a different trail across the hills. Baranor counted nearly 50 riders before the last vanished among the trees. "He is casting a wide net," Coran observed. Hendish nodded gravely. "Which means the fugitives still have a chance. Hervold does not know where they have gone." They rode hard through the morning, choosing hidden ranger paths that crossed the enemy's likely routes. The forest gradually thickened, its ancient oaks spreading broad branches that dimmed the sunlight beneath their leaves. Birds sang freely overhead, untouched by the fears troubling men below, while squirrels darted across fallen logs in search of acorns left from the previous autumn. The ordinary sounds of the woodland seemed strangely comforting after so many days spent among abandoned villages and hidden fortresses. Yet Baranor remained alert, for signs of hurried passage soon appeared along the trail. Broken ferns, hastily discarded blankets, and the faint prints of many feet led toward a narrow stream winding through the trees. Here the tracks became confused, as frightened families had crossed the water in different places, hoping to hide their direction. Hendich dismounted and walked slowly along the muddy bank, reading the scattered impressions with practiced patience. At last, he pointed toward a dense stand of hazel farther upstream. "The children crossed there," he said quietly. The adults doubled back through the water before following them. Baranor smiled despite the danger. Whoever led the escape possessed more wisdom than panic. The Rangers found the fugitives shortly before midday. Hidden within a sheltered hollow beneath towering beeches, nearly 36 villagers rested in exhausted silence, while several older boys stood watch with hunting bows. Women soothed crying children whose faces were pale from hunger and weariness. The moment Baranor stepped into the clearing, several men instinctively reached for axes and woodcutting tools. Fear had taught them caution. Before anyone could speak, Edric emerged from among the gathered families. His clothes were torn and dark circles surrounded his tired eyes, yet relief spread plainly across his face as he recognized the Rangers. "I prayed you would find us first," he said, hurrying forward. Baranor clasped his forearm firmly. "How did you escape?" Edric glanced back toward the waiting families. "The royal letters changed everything, though few knew why." He lowered his voice. Ceylon ordered the records sealed until he had studied them. While the officers argued over what came next, several guards who still trusted him relaxed their watch. We took the chance before Herwold tightened control again. An elderly woman stepped forward, leaning upon a carved walking staff, polished smooth by long use. "My father taught me the old ranger paths," she explained quietly. "His grandfather served the Dunedain before the kingdom fell." Hendrik bowed his head respectfully. "Then your family has preserved a great trust." She smiled sadly. "Only fragments, but fragments were enough." Baranor looked around the clearing and understood at last why the escape had succeeded. It had not been led by warriors or nobles. It had been guided by ordinary people who still remembered enough of the old ways to choose hope over fear. Their reunion was interrupted by the distant sound of a hunting horn echoing through the forest. Every face in the clearing turned toward the western hills. A second horn answered from farther north, followed moments later by a third. The signals formed a widening arc. Herwold's riders were closing the circle with practiced precision. Children instinctively drew closer to their parents, while the older men gripped their tools more tightly, despite knowing they would stand little chance against mounted soldiers. Baranor looked toward Hendach, waiting for orders. The older ranger knelt beside a broad stone, half hidden beneath moss, and brushed away leaves from its surface. Beneath them appeared another ancient carving of the white tree, surrounded by 7 stars. Hendach pressed firmly against one edge of the stone, and after several moments, it shifted with a deep, grinding sound. Beneath it yawned a narrow stair descending into darkness. Cool air flowed upward, carrying the clean scent of underground springs. Hendach looked toward the waiting villagers. "These passages were built for this very purpose," he said, "to preserve the people until the king could protect them once more." One by one, the families disappeared into the hidden refuge, while Baranor, Corun, and Hendach remained outside to conceal every trace of the entrance. The last child had scarcely descended when another hunting horn sounded, much closer now than before. Hoofbeats echoed faintly among the trees, growing steadily louder with every passing heartbeat. Baranor drew his sword for the first time since leaving Bree, its familiar weight steady in his hand. Across the forest, Captain Herwold's riders were finally approaching, and there would be no more hiding before the fate of the northern settlements was decided. The hoofbeats grew louder until they blended with the pounding of Baranor's own heart. Sunlight filtered through the high branches, casting shifting patches of gold across the forest floor, as Captain Herwold's riders emerged between the trees in disciplined formation. They advanced cautiously rather than charging, for the woodland narrowed their ranks and concealed dangers that no commander could fully measure. Herwold himself rode at their head, his eyes sweeping every shadow with practiced vigilance. He raised one hand, and the column halted at once. The silence that followed seemed heavier than the sound of the approaching horses had been. Baranor stepped from behind the great moss-covered stone before the hidden entrance, his grey cloak falling open to reveal the star brooch of the rangers. Hendach and Corun emerged beside him, each standing calmly with sword in hand, but neither seeking battle. Herwold regarded them for several moments before speaking. 3 rangers, he said evenly. I expected more. Hendach answered without raising his voice. 3 are enough to carry the king's authority where it is needed. Several of Herwold's men shifted uneasily in their saddles. They had expected frightened fugitives, not the silent confidence of the Dunedain. Herveld urged his horse forward a few paces. Stand aside, he said. The people who fled belong under my protection. Baranor met his gaze without wavering. Protection that cannot be refused is another name for captivity. The captain's expression hardened. You know nothing of what I have built? Baranor remembered the peaceful camps, the repaired roads, and the children laughing beside new homes. He also remembered the guarded paths, the hidden lies, and the fear that had begun the whole enterprise. I know enough, he replied quietly. A house built upon deception cannot remain standing forever. For a long moment, neither side moved. Wind stirred the leaves overhead, while somewhere deeper in the forest, a woodpecker struck steadily against an old oak. Then another sound drifted through the trees. It was not a horn or the clatter of hooves. but the clear call of a ranger's whistle answered by another far to the south. Hendrik smiled almost imperceptibly. Hervold turned sharply in the saddle as more whistles echoed across the hills, each one answered by another, until the woodland itself seemed alive with unseen watchers. The captain slowly realized what had happened. The escaped families had not merely fled. They had carried word to every ranger still guarding the north. Grey-cloaked figures began to appear among the trees, first 1, then 5, then 20. Some were young, others old enough that their beards had turned white, yet all wore the same weathered cloaks and carried the same long swords passed down through generations. They did not surround Hervold's company in threatening ranks. Instead, they quietly occupied the forest, standing among the trees with bows lowered and blades sheathed. Baranor recognized none of them, except one. From the eastern ridge stepped the lone, grey-cloaked watcher he had glimpsed days before. He approached Hendrik with a weary smile before clasping his forearm. "I reached Anuminas 3 nights ago," the ranger said. Every patrol answered the summons. Hervold looked from one silent ranger to another, counting more with every passing moment. His soldiers did the same. None reached for their weapons. They had not come seeking war against the king's own guardians, and many now understood that they stood opposed not to invaders, but to the lawful protectors of the realm. The captain slowly removed his helmet and let it hang from the saddle horn. "If I draw my sword," he said quietly, "many good men will die today." Hendrik inclined his head. "They will, and nothing you built will survive the blood spilled to defend it." Before Hervold could answer, another rider appeared upon the woodland path. He came alone, carrying no shield and wearing the plain traveling cloak of a scholar rather than a soldier. Ceylon dismounted before anyone spoke. His face bore the exhaustion of a man who had not slept since leaving the underground archive, and beneath one arm he carried the same leather portfolio Baranor had seen in the hidden chamber. The scholar walked directly toward Hervold without acknowledging the rangers. "It is over," he said simply. The captain stared at him in disbelief. "You would surrender everything?" Ceylon slowly shook his head. "There was never anything for me to claim." He opened the portfolio and withdrew the decree written by King Arvedui. The ancient parchment trembled slightly in the morning breeze. "I believed I was completing the work left unfinished by the last kings of Arna. Instead, I was preparing to betray it." His eyes swept across the gathered rangers before settling upon Hendrik. "The records belong to King Elessar, as they always did." Hervold's shoulders sagged, though disappointment rather than anger filled his expression. The North still needs stronger hands than distant promises. Ceylon nodded sadly. "Yes, but stronger hands are not the same as separate rule." He looked toward the hidden refuge beneath the stone, where frightened families waited in silence. "I taught people to fear abandonment more than false leadership. That was my failure." For several moments the captain remained motionless. Then, with slow deliberation, he unclasped his sword belt and handed it to one of the waiting rangers. No cheer followed. No triumphant cry echoed through the forest. The rangers quietly accepted the surrender of Hervold and those who chose to lay down their arms. Others were escorted peacefully to Anuminas, where King Elessar's judges would hear each man's part in the affair with fairness rather than vengeance. The hidden settlements were opened, and their people were told the full truth of how they had come there. Many chose to remain upon the lands they had cleared, but now they did so freely under the protection of the reunited kingdom instead of secret authority. The forgotten roads and refugees passed once more into the keeping of the rangers, who carefully sealed those passages that no longer served any honest purpose. Several weeks later, Baranor rode beside Hendrik through the restored streets of Anuminas, where the recovered records had been placed under the care of the king's scholars. Salon worked among them as well, not as their master, but as their most diligent servant, spending his days preserving the knowledge he had nearly misused. King Alessar himself ordered that the decree of Arvedui be copied and placed within every restored archive of the north, so that no future generation would mistake guardianship for dominion. Edric returned with his family to rebuild his village, while the woman who had first warned the rangers at the lonely farm received quiet thanks that never appeared in any chronicle, though those who knew the truth never forgot her courage. As autumn spread across the northern hills, Baranor paused upon the crest of a familiar ridge overlooking the old greenway. Merchants once again travelled safely toward Bree. Children laughed beside the roadside, and farmers worked fields that only months before had stood abandoned. The ruined watchtowers still crowned the distant hills, reminders of wars that could never be entirely forgotten. Yet they no longer seemed haunted by the weight of ancient fear. The greatest shadow had not been the memory of Angmar, nor the lies spoken in its name, but the belief that the past could be claimed by any single man. That shadow had passed, and the North endured as it always had, not through pride or hidden power, but through faithful hearts who remembered that every kingdom worthy of preservation must first remain true to the purpose for which it was founded. When you walk through the histories of Middle-earth, you soon discover that evil rarely returns wearing the same face. The great tyrants may fall, their towers may crumble, and their armies may vanish into dust. Yet the desire to rule the wills of others survives in quieter forms. It borrows noble words, honorable memories, and even the works of the wise, hoping that no one will notice where truth ends and ambition begins. That is why the greatest victories are not always won with swords. They are won when a man remembers what a kingdom is truly meant to protect, and when he refuses to claim as his own what was entrusted only to his keeping. In Tolkien's world, power is tested not by whether it can be taken, but by whether it can be laid aside when conscience demands it. You may also notice that the darkest danger in this tale was never an ancient spirit awakening beneath forgotten hills. The true peril came from ordinary people, making understandable choices for understandable reasons. Fear persuaded villagers to abandon their homes. Weariness made comforting lies sound wiser than difficult truths. Even Salon did not begin as a servant of darkness. He began as a man who loved the history of his people so deeply that he slowly convinced himself the past belonged to him more than to those who had inherited it lawfully. Tolkien returned to this lesson again and again. The fall of good people is often quieter than the rise of openly wicked ones, and therefore it demands greater vigilance from every generation that follows. Yet the story does not leave you in sorrow, because Middle-earth has always measured hope differently from victory. Hope is found in a frightened mother who risks everything with a silent sign scratched into the earth. It lives in forgotten paths, remembered by an old woman, in a laborer who chooses honesty over safety, and in rangers who continue their lonely watch without expecting songs or glory. Such people rarely appear in the grand chronicles until someone looks closely enough to find them. But they are the reason kingdoms endure after kings have passed away. Great halls may preserve records, and ancient fortresses may shelter treasures, yet the true inheritance of the West survives only while faithful hearts choose duty above pride. Perhaps that is why the old kingdoms never truly vanished. Their walls collapsed, their banners faded, and their roads disappeared beneath grass and moss, but their purpose remained alive wherever mercy stood beside courage and wisdom restrained strength. The long defeat that runs through the history of Middle-earth is never answered by perfect triumph. Instead, it is answered by endurance, by memory rightly kept, and by each generation deciding that the failures of the past will not become the pattern of the future. Every faithful choice, however small, becomes another stone laid upon foundations that outlast any fortress built by ambition alone. And so, when you leave these northern hills behind, imagine them once more beneath the quiet light of an early spring morning. Mist drifts slowly across the old roads, white blossoms open beside weathered stones, and forgotten watchtowers stand against the sky as they have for countless years. Travelers pass in peace, scarcely noticing the silent rangers who keep their watch from distant ridges, content that no one speaks their names. The shadow has become only a memory, and memory itself has found its rightful place. If you listen closely, you may hear nothing more than the wind moving through the grass, just as it did when this journey began, carrying with it the quiet promise that while faithful hearts remain, hope will always find the road home.